My family didn't choose my sister over me in one dramatic moment. That's the part one need you to understand first, because the dramatic version would have been easier, something I could have pointed to, named, confronted cleanly. What actually happened was quieter than that, and slower, and considerably harder to fight. It happened in 100 small moments over 30 years. The way my mother's face changed when Lily walked into a room, that specific brightening that happened with Lily and only with Lily, a light being switched on that had never quite switched on for me. It happened in which daughter got called first with news, which daughter's opinions were sought before decisions were made, which daughter's presence at family events was treated as essential rather than assumed. It happened in which daughter received the larger portion of the inheritance when my father died, not through malice, never through malice, but through the specific, unconscious logic of a family that had, over decades, simply assumed that the daughter who seemed to need less was a daughter who actually needed less. I was 31 the first time I understood, clearly and completely, what had been happening to me. I was at Lily's engagement party, organized by my mother, at my parents' house, in the garden that my mother and I had planted together years earlier, a project I had planned and funded and dug the soil for on 3 consecutive weekends, the project that had become, over the years, the thing most visitors mentioned when they came to the house. My mother introduced me to one of Lily's fiancé's relatives as Lily's older sister. Not by name, not with any of the things that were true about me, my job, my apartment, the garden itself, any of the 100 specific details that distinguish one person from a placeholder, just Lily's older sister. I drove home that night and sat in my parking lot for a long time. And then I woke up 23 years old again, 8 years before that party, with 31 years of memory and the specific, clarifying knowledge of exactly what I had been doing wrong. This is the story of what I did differently. I woke up in my old apartment, the small one-bedroom I'd had at 23, before the better job, before the slow accumulation of a life built carefully around the quiet certainty that my family found other things more interesting than me. Lily's memories, my memories, I corrected myself immediately, all of this was my memory, told me the date, a Tuesday in March, 8 years before the engagement party that had finally made everything visible. 8 years before I had sat in a parking lot and understood, for the first time, the full shape of what I'd been living inside. 8 years. I lay on the familiar ceiling of a bedroom I hadn't occupied in nearly a decade, and did the math. At 23, I was still in the early years of the pattern, still at the point where it was possible to tell myself I was imagining it, that the small consistent differences in how my family treated me and how they treated Lily were simply the ordinary variation of family love rather than the structural imbalance I would spend the next 8 years absorbing in silence. At 23, my sister was 20, still in college, still at the stage where the family's orientation toward her felt like protection rather than preference. At 23, my father was still alive. He would die at 64, when I was 27, and the inheritance would be split in a way that I had told myself, at the time, was simply an oversight, a legal technicality, something that didn't mean what it looked like it meant. I understood, lying there, that I had spent 8 years giving my family the benefit of every doubt I had available to give. I was not going to do that this time. I want to describe the pattern carefully, because I think the specific mechanics of it mattered more than any single incident. The way it worked was precisely through its diffuseness, its resistance to being named as any one thing. My parents were not cruel people. I want to be completely clear about that, because the easy version of this story makes them villains, and they were not villains. They were 2 people who had, somewhere in the early years of raising 2 daughters, developed an unconscious but consistent orientation. Lily required more, got more, was given more of everything the family had to offer, because Lily made it visible when she needed things. I had, early and thoroughly, learned not to make my needs visible. I cannot tell you exactly when this happened, somewhere in the years before memory properly consolidates, somewhere in the gap between being 2 children in the same house and being 2 distinct people with distinct emotional needs that a family had to decide, daily and unconsciously, how to distribute. What I know is that by the time I was old enough to notice the difference, I had already learned that noticing it out loud produced nothing useful, no redistribution of attention, no acknowledgement of the imbalance, just a vague family defensiveness that felt worse than saying nothing at all. So I said nothing. Year after year, I said nothing, and the family took my silence as confirmation that I was fine, that the existing arrangement was working, that the daughter who didn't ask for things was the daughter who didn't need them. My father's inheritance was the clearest and most legible version of it, the only one that left. A document I could have pointed to if I'd chosen to fight it, 60% to Lily, 40% to me. with a note in his will that explained the split as being proportional to ongoing needs, a phrase that had clearly seemed reasonable to him at the time of writing and that had, when I first read it at 27, produced a specific, cold grief that I had immediately buried under the more socially acceptable grief of losing a father. I was not going to bury it this time. There is a specific memory I want to tell you about, because I think it captures the pattern more clearly than any amount of general description can, and because it was the memory I kept returning to in the week after I woke up 23 again, the one I kept using as a kind of calibration for how real what I was remembering actually was. I was 16. Lily was 13. Our father had gotten a promotion, the first significant one of his career, the kind that comes with a dinner out and a general feeling of family celebration. He had announced it at dinner, and I remembered the exact quality of the moment. My mother's delight, genuine and warm, Lily's excitement, expressive and immediate, and my own quiet congratulations, genuine but smaller in register than my sister's, less visible, less amplified. After dinner, my father had taken Lily to the kitchen to show her how to make his mother's chocolate cake recipe, something he'd been promising to teach her for months, a promise I had heard him make and watched him keep. I had cleared the table and loaded the dishwasher, the way I usually did, and I had felt, even then, at 16, something I couldn't quite name, some gap between what was happening and what I wanted to be happening that I was not yet equipped to examine directly. I did not examine it directly. I filed it under the general category of this is how things are and moved on. What I understood now, with 31 years of perspective, was that this was not a singular incident of differential treatment. It was a representative sample of hundreds of identical incidents, distributed across 16 years by then, through which my family had built a specific and consistent picture of which daughter was the one you made plans with, shared rituals with, brought into projects, and which daughter was simply the one who kept the machinery of the household moving while those rituals happened. I had been the machinery. Not because I was unloved. Not because my parents were calculating or cruel. But because I had, early and efficiently, made myself into someone the family could rely on without having to actively choose, and that quiet reliability had, over years, calcified into invisibility. Standing in the kitchen at 16, loading the dishwasher while my father and sister made chocolate cake in the next room, I had told myself it was fine. Standing in my apartment at 23, with the memory of a parking lot and a party and 31 years of its fine sitting in me like sediment, I had finally run out of room for fine. 1 week into being 23 again, I called my mother. Not to confront her, not yet, and not in the way I might have wanted to if I'd let the 8 years of accumulated grievance run unchecked through the conversation. I called because I had decided, in the week since waking up in my old apartment, that whatever I did in these 8 reclaimed years was not going to be about punishing my family for a pattern they had never been asked to examine. It was going to be about making sure the pattern got examined, because I understood, now, that unexamined was exactly how it had survived for so long. Can I ask you something? I said, once we'd gotten through the ordinary pleasantries of a Tuesday phone call, something I've been thinking about. Of course, my mother said, warm, unsuspecting. Do you think you treat Lily and me differently? I asked, as directly and non-accusatorially as I could manage, which was more direct than I had ever managed the first time through these years. Not in a big way, necessarily. Just, in the small ways. Day to day. There was a pause. The specific pause of someone who had not been asked this question before and was not sure, in real time, whether there was a safe answer. I love both my daughters equally, my mother said, finally, with the particular careful warmth of someone saying the thing that is supposed to close the question. I know, I said. I didn't ask whether you love us equally. I asked whether you treat us differently. Another pause. Longer. What makes you ask? She said. I've been thinking about it, I said. I've been trying to understand some things about how our family works. I'm not trying to start a fight. I'm asking honestly, because I'd rather have an honest conversation than let something sit unaddressed for years. My mother said something careful and general about how every child was different and required different things, and I listened, and did not push further, and ended the call on good terms, and sat afterward with what I had actually accomplished. Not much, in that single conversation. But something. A question, planted where no question had been before, in a soil that had never been asked to support the weight of this particular examination. I had 8 years. I could afford to plant things carefully. 3 months after that first phone call with my mother, my father's 62nd birthday happened. A family gathering at my parents' house, the kind that had recurred annually for as long as I could remember, and that I now experienced with the specific double vision of someone who has lived through a version of this day before. I arrived early, the way I always had, because arriving early was part of the invisible machinery of being the capable, self-sufficient daughter. You arrived early so that things were managed before anyone arrived to notice they needed managing. I brought food, because I always brought food. I helped set up, because I always helped set up. And then, Lily arrived, 40 minutes later, and the room changed in the way rooms changed when Lily walked into them, my mother crossing to her immediately, my father's face doing its particular brightening, the gathering reorganizing its center of gravity without anyone deciding to or apparently noticing that it had. I had lived through this specific dynamic several hundred times. This time, I watched it instead of simply absorbing it. What I saw, watching instead of absorbing, was something I had not quite seen clearly before. Not malice, not conscious choice, but a pattern so old and so internalized that it no longer required anyone to actively enact it. My father did not think I will light up for Lily and not for my other daughter. He simply lit up for Lily, because that is what he had done for 25 years, because lighting up for Lily had become, over that time, as reflexive and unexamined as any other deeply practiced response. I understood, watching it, that confronting the pattern was always going to be harder than confronting a choice, because a choice has a person making it, and a pattern simply has momentum and time. Later that evening, when the gathering had settled into the comfortable post-dinner slowdown of a family that knew how to spend time together even if it didn't always know what it was actually doing while doing so, I sat beside my father and asked him about his year, the way I always did, and then I told him about mine, which I had not always done, which I had learned, over the previous 3 months, to do more regularly and more specifically. He listened. He asked follow-up questions, the kind that required him to have actually heard what I'd said rather than simply waited for his turn to speak. And at the end of the conversation, he said something that surprised me, that I had not heard him say the first time through this birthday. You seem different this year. More settled in yourself, somehow. I'm working on that, I said. It suits you, he said, simply, and turned to say something to my mother, and the party continued, and no single dramatic thing had changed. But I had said something true about my own life at my father's birthday party, and he had actually heard it, and that particular small shift, invisible to anyone watching, enormously significant to me, was the kind of change that doesn't announce itself, that simply accumulates, day by day, into a different baseline. I want to describe what I did about the inheritance, because it was the most practically significant thing I changed in these 8 years, and the most illuminating about how the pattern actually worked when it was directly examined rather than quietly absorbed. My father died when I was 27, the same age as the first timeline, the same morning, the same long illness I had watched and sat through and been present for in exactly the same way. I want to be clear that I did not try to change his death, or the shape of his illness, or the final months that we all spent gathered in a particular kind of grief. Some things are not within the scope of what a second chance is for. What I did change was the conversation. 3 months before he died, when it was clear the illness had reached the stage where certain conversations needed to happen, I asked to speak with my father alone. Not dramatically, simply clearly, the way I had been practicing clarity for 4 years by then, the specific habit of saying things directly that I had spent 8 years of my first life carefully avoiding. Dad, I said, I want to talk about the will. Not to pressure you about any particular decision. It's your estate, and how you divide it is entirely your right. But I want you to know something first, so that whatever you decide, you're making it with accurate information. He looked at me with the particular attention of a man who had spent 4 years watching a daughter he thought he understood become, gradually and unmistakably, someone who said things he hadn't expected her to say. I told him, quietly and specifically, the ways in which the family's unconscious orientation toward Lily had shaped my experience of growing up. Not as an accusation. I had rehearsed this carefully enough to strip the accusation out of it, leaving something that sounded closer to documentation than grievance. I told him about the introductions, the consultations, the small accumulated weight of being consistently the daughter who needed less because she had learned not to say she needed anything. My father listened with the full attention of a man who, I understood watching him, had genuinely not understood the shape of what he was being told. Not because he was obtuse. He was not, but because the pattern had been so diffuse, so distributed across so many years and small moments, that no single instance of it had ever been legible enough to add up to what it actually added up to. I didn't know, he said, finally. Quietly. I genuinely didn't know. I know, I said. That's why I'm telling you now. He rewrote the will 2 weeks later. Equally, simply, without drama, a straightforward correction to a document that had encoded an imbalance he hadn't realized he was encoding. Lily never mentioned it, which suggested she either hadn't known the original split or had known and chosen not to examine what it said about the family's assumptions. My father died 6 weeks after that conversation. I will not pretend his final weeks were not hard, or that the conversation we had made his loss feel smaller. They were hard, and it didn't. But I held his hand at the end knowing that something had been said between us that needed saying, and he died knowing something about both his daughters that he hadn't known before. That seemed, in the specific accounting of last things, like worth something. I want to describe what I built for myself, across the 8 reclaimed years, because I think the things you build for yourself matter as much as the things you say to the people who should have been seeing you more clearly all along. At 23, I had been working in marketing, competent, underpaid, the kind of position that rewards patience and punishes ambition in equal measure. I had told myself, the first time through these years, that the cautious path was sensible, that building slowly was the responsible thing to do, that the visible confidence it would have taken to reach for more was simply not how I operated. I understood now that the caution had been part of the same pattern. The daughter who didn't ask for things at home was the employee who didn't advocate for herself at work, for the same reasons and through the same mechanism. A lifetime of learned smallness that had stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like a personality. I started, at 23 in a week, by asking for a raise I had been earning for 6 months. My manager, slightly surprised, said yes. The simplicity of it stayed with me for a long time, the specific revelation of discovering that the ask itself had been the entire obstacle, that the thing I had spent 6 months not doing was simply the thing I needed to do, and that the world did not, in fact, collapse when I asked it for something directly. I kept pushing, steadily and without apology, in a way that felt at first almost indecent, the specific discomfort of someone discovering that taking up space is, in fact, permitted, and struggling to believe it even as the evidence accumulates. A different job at 25, better aligned with what I was actually good at. My manager, at the new firm, on my 3rd day, asked me to present a campaign strategy I'd been developing to the senior team, not because she'd reviewed it first, but because she'd seen enough of my thinking to trust that the presentation was worth the room's time. I gave the presentation with a confidence I had not known was available to me, the kind that comes from simply having decided, sometime in the previous 2 years, that my ideas were worth the space they required. A freelance project at 26 that led to a second one, and a third, and eventually to a small consultancy I ran from my apartment in the evenings before it became something I ran full-time. The first client I signed was a mid-sized company that had been burned by a larger agency and needed someone who could be trusted with their brand without the overhead of a firm that couldn't afford to actually pay attention to a client their size. I charged a rate I had initially been afraid to name, because naming it felt like claiming something I wasn't sure I deserved. The client said yes in the same email they asked for a start date. I told Nadia about the consultancy over coffee, the first time it had made enough money to constitute a real thing rather than a side project. How does it feel? She asked. Like something that's actually mine, I said. Not built for anyone else. Not shaped around what anyone else needed from me. Just mine. Good, she said. That's exactly what it should feel like. By 29, I had a business that supported me comfortably, a small team of 3 people whose work I genuinely respected, and the specific, settled confidence of someone who had stopped waiting for external validation to confirm what she already knew about herself. I had not been waiting for my family to choose me. I had chosen myself, incrementally, quietly, without announcement, and the choosing had, over 6 years, become simply who I was. I want to describe my relationship with Lily during these 8 years, because I think it mattered enormously that the second chance did not produce, in me, any desire to damage my sister. Lily was not the architect of our family's favoritism. She had not asked to be preferred, had not lobbied for the inheritance split, had not engineered the specific quality of our parents' attention. She had simply received what was given, the way anyone receives what they are given when they are young, without fully understanding what its receipt says about the accounting behind it. I had spent the first version of these years alternating between loving Lily genuinely and resenting her in ways I was ashamed of, the resentment and the love tangled together in a way that made both of them less clean than they should have been. The second time, I separated them. I loved Lily. I continued loving her, in the straightforward, uncomplicated way that is possible once you've stopped holding someone responsible for what was done in their name. I told her things I hadn't told her the first time, including, eventually, once enough. Trust had been built, an honest account of what growing up in her shadow had felt like. Not as an accusation, not as a wound to transfer, simply as the truth between two sisters who had never quite talked to each other at the level where truth actually lived. Lily, hearing it, was quiet for a long time. I always thought you were fine, she said, finally. You always seemed so capable. So, sorted. I didn't think you needed anything I wasn't already providing. I know, I said. That's what I was communicating. It wasn't actually what I was feeling. Why didn't you say something? She asked, and there was nothing accusatory in it, just the genuine, slightly bereft confusion of someone discovering, belatedly, that the story they thought they knew had a different story inside it. Because I didn't know how, I said. And because I didn't believe it would change anything. I know that's not fair to you. But it's the true answer. We talked for 3 hours that afternoon, on a park bench, in a conversation that felt like something long waterlogged finally drying out. It was uncomfortable and necessary and, by the end, something I was deeply grateful for, not because everything was resolved, because it wasn't, but because the space between us had changed. We were no longer two sisters performing a version of a relationship neither of us had fully examined. We were two people trying, finally, to actually have one. I want to describe something that happened the year after the conversation with Lily, because I think it mattered in a different way, not family, but the specific reckoning of explaining your family to someone who has no stake in protecting it. Her name was Nadia. I had known her for 2 years through work, the kind of professional acquaintance that transitions into actual friendship around the point where you realize you've started calling each other about things that have nothing to do with work. She was sharp, direct, and had the particular useful quality of listening to what you actually said, rather than what she expected you to say. We were at dinner when I told her, not deliberately, not as a planned unburdening, but in the way things come out when you've spent a certain amount of time in your own head and suddenly find yourself across the table from someone capable of actually hearing them. Can I ask you something? She said, after I'd described something about my weekend, a family dinner that had followed the usual pattern of the family's attention organizing itself around Lily while I made easy, accommodating conversation in the margins. Sure, I said. Does your family know how much you manage for them? She asked. Not just the practical stuff, I mean, emotionally. Does anyone in that house know how much you're absorbing and how little you're getting back? I sat with the question for a moment. They're starting to, I said. I've been working on that. Starting to, she repeated. Not unkindly. And before you started working on it, how long did you just absorb it without saying anything? A long time, I admitted. That sounds exhausting, she said. Not as a platitude, as a direct observation, the specific comment of someone doing the math and arriving at the correct number. It was, I said. I didn't know it was, for a long time, because it had been that way for so long it just felt like how things were. Like my personality. The capable, self-sufficient one who doesn't need anything. That's not a personality, Nadia said, flatly. That's a coping strategy that got mistaken for one. I felt something land cleanly, hearing that. The specific sensation of having something named precisely that you had been circling in your own head without finding quite the right words. I'm working on it, I said again. Good, she said, because you're also, just so you know, one of the most competent, observant people I've worked with in years. And I want to make sure we're clear that those qualities are yours, not things you developed so that your family would have a reason to need you around. I drove home from that dinner thinking about what she'd said for most of the journey. Not because it was news. I had been doing the work of understanding these things for several years by then, in the quiet, gradual way that self-understanding actually tends to happen. But because hearing it said plainly, by someone outside the family system who had no investment in softening it, gave it a different weight. It is one thing to understand something about yourself. It is another to have someone see it, clearly enough to say it out loud. The engagement party arrived on schedule, the same garden, the same relatives, the same soft afternoon light that had, in the original timeline, been the backdrop for the specific, quiet devastation of being introduced as Lily's older sister, to someone whose name I would not remember the following morning. I had known it was coming. I had spent 8 years, in some sense, approaching this day, not dreading it, but preparing for it, the way you prepare for something you've decided to experience differently rather than simply survive. My mother caught me by the arm as the party was filling in around us, early enough that there was still just the two of us in a quiet corner of the garden. You look lovely, she said, and I heard in it something that hadn't been in her voice the first time, a slight careful quality, the specific attentiveness of someone who had, over 4 years of gradual, persistent honesty from a daughter she thought she understood, begun to pay a different kind of attention. Thank you, I said. I want to tell you something, before the party properly gets going. Something I've been meaning to say for a while. She looked at me, waiting. I know this is Lily's day, I said, and I want it to be. I'm genuinely happy for her. But I also want you to know, and I want you to hear this as what it is, not as a complaint, just as information, that how I'm introduced today matters to me. Not as an afterthought, not as an extension of someone else. I'd like, if someone asks who I am, to be a person rather than a reference. My mother looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across her face, complicated, quick, the specific expression of someone recognizing something they had been doing without realizing they were doing it. Of course, she said, quietly. I hear you. She did not introduce me as Lily's older sister that afternoon. She introduced me by name, by profession, with 2 or 3 specific, accurate details about who I was. It was a small thing. It was exactly the right thing. I stood in the garden we had planted together and talked to people at my sister's engagement party, and felt, for the first time at a family event I could remember, simply present, not overlooked, not peripheral, just there, in my own right, which was all I had ever wanted. It has been 2 years since the engagement party. Lily is married now, to a man who makes her happy in the specific, quietly demonstrable way that lasting happiness tends to work. Not through grand gestures but through consistent, small choices, the kind that accumulate over years into something that holds. Like him, genuinely, he sees Lily clearly, and that particular quality has always been the one I cared about most in the people my sister brings into her life. There was a moment at the wedding, the reception, late, when the speeches had been given and the dancing had settled into its comfortable, slightly tired second act, when Lily found me at my table and sat down beside me without anyone asking her to, without any obligation pulling her in that direction. We talked for 40 minutes, about nothing particularly significant, her honeymoon plans, a funny thing that had happened with the seating chart, a memory we'd both had of our grandmother, who'd died before either of us was old enough to know her well. It was, by any external measure, an entirely ordinary conversation. But I kept thinking about it afterward, because of how it had felt. Like 2 people who had simply chosen to be in the same conversation, without either of them managing the dynamic or performing a version of sisterhood for the benefit of anyone watching. Like something that was happening because both of us wanted it to, rather than because the occasion required it. That was new. It had taken 8 years and several painful conversations to become ordinary. My mother and I have a different relationship than the one I carried through the first version of these years. It is not a perfect relationship, I want to be honest about that, because I think the version where everything is resolved cleanly and permanently would be a comforting lie. We are 2 people who have had, over the past several years, more honest conversations than we managed in the 3 decades before them, and whose relationship has been changed by that honesty in ways that are real and worth having, even when they are also sometimes uncomfortable. She mentioned, a few months ago, something that surprised me, unprompted, quietly, over coffee at her kitchen table, the table we have sat across from each other at for 30 years of varying quality of actual communication. I've been thinking, she said, about how differently I treated you and Lily when you were growing up. I don't think I fully understood what I was doing. I've been sitting with that. I know, I said. Thank you for saying it. I wish I'd understood it sooner, she said. So do I said. But I think the fact that we're talking about it now matters more than how long it took. She nodded, and reached across the table and squeezed my hand, the same gesture she'd always made when words didn't quite reach where she needed them to go, and I let it be. What it was, not an absolution, not a complete resolution, just a mother trying, with the tools available to her, to say something true to a daughter she had not always fully seen. What I felt, in that kitchen, was not the sharp grief of the parking lot. That particular grief had, over years, resolved into something different, something smaller and quieter that I no longer needed to carry in the forefront of everything. What I felt was something closer to recognition. A woman in her 60s examining a pattern she'd lived inside for decades, finding it uncomfortable, and choosing to say something about it rather than letting the discomfort pass without a name. It was, I understood, exactly what I had been asking my family to do for 8 years. They were learning, slowly, genuinely, in the specific unglamorous way that people learn things they were never taught in the first place. I run my consultancy full-time now, 7 people, a client list I'm proud of, work that feels entirely mine in the way that work only feels once you've stopped apologizing for being good at it. Nadia joined as a partner 2 years ago, the natural conclusion of a working friendship that had long since become the best professional relationship of my career. I have a small apartment with good light and high ceilings, the specific indulgence of someone who has learned, gradually, to give herself the things she would have once decided she didn't deserve without examining why. I am in a relationship, cautiously, happily, with a man named James who I met through a client event, who asked, on our second date, what I was proudest of in my professional life and then actually listened to the answer without redirecting it toward himself. It is, by any measure, an ordinary thing. It is also, for reasons I have spent several years gradually understanding, the first relationship I've been in where I did not unconsciously shrink myself into the shape that would be easiest to accommodate. I think about the first version of these years sometimes, the version where the engagement party was simply the moment I finally understood what I'd been living inside, and I drove home and sat in my parking lot, alone. I think about that woman with the specific, tender grief of someone looking at a version of herself she no longer is. Still capable, still functional, still building things, but doing all of it with the particular silent exhaustion of someone who has absorbed, for 30 years, the message that what she was building was slightly less important than what was being built in the next room. She wasn't wrong about what was happening. She was just very, very tired. And she did not yet know. This is the part one wish most that I could tell her, knowing I cannot, knowing that the only way to know it is to live it, that the tiredness was not a permanent feature of being herself. That it was a feature of a specific arrangement she had been handed and had never been invited to refuse. That refusing it, even partially, even slowly, even with difficulty, would not make her someone else. It would make her more complete.